The year is 1865. The smoke has cleared from America's bloodiest battlefields, and a nation lies divided, exhausted, and forever changed. Over 600,000 souls have perished in a war that tore families apart and redefined the very meaning of freedom. As President Lincoln's body lies in state, carried by funeral train across a grieving nation, few could imagine that from the ashes of this devastating conflict would rise the most spectacular period of growth, innovation, and inequality in American history. The Civil War has ended, but America's greatest transformation is just beginning. In the span of a single generation, the United States will evolve from a largely agricultural society into an industrial powerhouse that will reshape the world. This is the story of the Gilded Age, an era when titans walked the earth and built empires that would define a nation. It is a tale of unprecedented wealth and crushing poverty, of brilliant innovation and ruthless competition, of immigrant dreams and worker struggles. It is the story of how America became America. As the guns fall silent in April 1865, the nation that emerges from war bears little resemblance to the one that entered it 4 years earlier. The federal government has grown powerful beyond anything the founding fathers could have envisioned. Railroads, born of wartime necessity, now stretch like iron veins across the continent. New technologies, forged in the crucible of conflict, stand ready to transform daily life. Most importantly, the war has created a new class of men who understand that in this new America, fortunes will be made not on plantations or farms, but in the factories, railroads, and counting houses of an industrial age. In the immediate aftermath of Appomattox, America faces the monumental task of Reconstruction, not just of the South, but of the entire nation's identity. The federal government, having learned to mobilize resources on an unprecedented scale during wartime, now turns its attention to binding the nation together with bands of steel. The Pacific Railway Act, signed by Lincoln in 1862, has authorized the construction of a transcontinental railroad, a project so audacious that it will require the labor of thousands and the investment of millions. This great endeavor will become the launching pad for some of America's greatest fortunes, and the stage upon which the drama of the Gilded Age will unfold. Among those who recognize the transformative power of this moment is a young man named Cornelius Vanderbilt. Though young is hardly the word for someone who has already spent 4 decades building a transportation empire. Born in 1794 to a poor farming family on Staten Island, Vanderbilt began his career ferrying passengers and freight between Staten Island and Manhattan. By the 1860s, he commands a fleet of steamships that dominates water transportation along the eastern seaboard. But Vanderbilt, now in his 70s, possesses the vision of a man half his age. He sees that the future belongs not to ships, but to railroads. Vanderbilt's transformation from steamship king to railroad baron begins with a simple observation. The railroads are inefficient, fragmented, and ripe for consolidation. In 1867, at the age of 73, he takes control of the New York Central Railroad, beginning a campaign of acquisition and consolidation that will create the largest railroad system in America. His methods are ruthless and effective. When competitors attempt to block his expansion, Vanderbilt employs a strategy that will become legendary in American business. He cuts off their access to his steamship lines and railroad connections, strangling their ability to move goods and passengers. "Law? What do I care about the law?" Vanderbilt reportedly declares. "Ain't I got the power?" The Commodore, as he is universally known, understands that in the new America, power flows not from political office, but from control over the arteries of commerce. His railroad empire will eventually stretch from New York to Chicago, carrying the goods and people that fuel America's westward expansion. By the time of his death in 1877, Vanderbilt will have amassed a fortune of over $100 million, making him the richest man in America. More importantly, he will have demonstrated that in the post-war economy, those bold enough to think big and ruthless enough to act decisively can accumulate wealth on a scale previously unimaginable. But Vanderbilt's story is just one thread in the complex tapestry of Gilded Age America. As his trains carry passengers and freight across the continent, they also carry the hopes and dreams of millions of immigrants who see America as a land of opportunity. Between 1865 and 1900, over 14 million immigrants will arrive on American shores, the largest wave of immigration in the nation's history. They come from Ireland and Germany, from Italy and Poland, from China and Scandinavia, each group bringing its own culture, traditions, and desperate hunger for a better life. The journey to America is itself a trial by ordeal. Passengers in steerage endure weeks at sea in conditions that would shock even the most hardened observer. Packed into the lower decks of steamships like human cargo, they battle seasickness, disease, and despair. The lucky ones travel in groups, maintaining connections to family and community. The unlucky travel alone, carrying nothing but the clothes on their backs and dreams of streets paved with gold. What they find upon arrival is often far different from what they imagined. Ellis Island, which opens as America's primary immigration station in 1892, processes thousands of new arrivals daily. Each immigrant faces a medical examination and an interrogation designed to weed out those deemed unfit for American society. Those who pass through the gates of this island of hope and tears will fan out across the continent, providing the muscle and sinew for America's industrial transformation. They will dig the mines, build the railroads, and work the factories that power the Gilded Age economy. Their story is inseparable from the story of America's rise to industrial dominance. Many of these immigrants find their way to the coal mines of Pennsylvania, where they descend daily into darkness to extract the black gold that powers America's industrial revolution. Coal is the lifeblood of the Gilded Age, providing the energy that drives the factories, heats the homes, and powers the locomotives that bind the nation together. The work is dangerous beyond imagination. Cave-ins, explosions, and toxic gases claim thousands of lives each year. The miners, many of them recent immigrants from Ireland, Poland, and Eastern Europe, work 12-hour shifts in conditions that would horrify modern observers. In the anthracite fields of Pennsylvania, entire communities spring up around the mines. Company towns, owned lock, stock, and barrel by the mining companies, houseworkers and their families in cramped, poorly constructed buildings. The miners are paid in company scrip, worthless outside the company store, ensuring their permanent dependence on their employers. Children as young as 8 years old work as breaker boys, sorting coal from slate with bare hands that quickly become scarred and blackened. For these families, the American dream often feels more like a nightmare. But they endure because they know that even this harsh existence offers more hope than what they left behind in the old country. The coal that these miners extract with their blood and sweat fuels not only the factories of the East, but also the great adventure of westward expansion. The Transcontinental Railroad, that marvel of 19th century engineering, consumes vast quantities of coal as it slowly pushes its way across the American continent. The construction of this railroad is an epic undertaking that will require the labor of over 100,000 workers and consumes 7 years of backbreaking effort. From the east, the Union Pacific Railroad builds westward from Omaha, employing mainly Irish immigrants and Civil War veterans. From the west, the Central Pacific builds eastward from Sacramento, relying heavily on Chinese workers who have crossed the Pacific in search of opportunity. These Chinese immigrants, many of them fleeing poverty and political upheaval in their homeland, prove to be remarkably skilled and dedicated workers. They tackle the most dangerous jobs, blasting through the granite peaks of the Sierra Nevada with primitive explosives, often lowered down sheer cliff faces in wicker baskets to place charges in the rock. The meeting of these two great construction crews at Promontory Point, Utah, in May 1869, represents more than just the completion of a railroad. It symbolizes the binding together of a continent and the birth of a truly national economy. The golden spike driven into the rails on that historic day connects not just East and West, but past and future. America is no longer a collection of regional economies loosely bound together by common government. It is becoming a unified market of continental proportions, capable of supporting enterprises on a scale never before attempted. This transformation creates opportunities for a new breed of entrepreneur, men who think not in terms of local or even regional markets, but in terms of national and international commerce. Among the first to recognize and exploit these opportunities is a young Scottish immigrant named Andrew Carnegie. Born in 1835 to a family of weavers in Dunfermline, Scotland, Carnegie arrives in America in 1848 as a 12-year-old boy whose family has been impoverished by the industrial changes sweeping across Britain. Carnegie's rise from bobbin boy in a cotton factory to master of the steel industry reads like something from a Horatio Alger novel. His first job in America pays him $1.20 per week, but young Andrew possesses qualities that will serve him well in Gilded Age America: an insatiable hunger for self-improvement, an ability to recognize and seize opportunities, and a charm that opens doors wherever he goes. By age 16, he has talked his way into a job as a telegraph operator, where he learns not just how to send and receive messages, but how information itself can be turned into profit. Carnegie's real education begins when he goes to work for the Pennsylvania Railroad, one of the premier corporations of the age. Under the tutelage of Thomas Scott, the railroad's ambitious superintendent, Carnegie learns the fundamentals of modern business management. He sees how large-scale enterprises can be organized and controlled, how capital can be raised and deployed, and how competition can be managed or eliminated. Most importantly, he learns to think systematically about efficiency and cost reduction, skills that will serve him well when he enters the steel business. The transformation of Carnegie from railroad manager to steel magnate begins with a simple observation. America's rapid industrialization requires vast quantities of steel, but the American steel industry remains primitive and inefficient compared to its European counterparts. Carnegie has the vision to see that steel will become the fundamental building material of industrial America, needed not just for railroad rails, but for buildings, bridges, ships, and countless other applications. In 1875, he opens his first major steel plant, the Edgar Thomson Works near Pittsburgh, and immediately sets about revolutionizing American steel production. Carnegie's approach to the steel business reflects the systematic thinking he learned in the railroad industry. He invests heavily in the most advanced technology available, including the Bessemer process, which dramatically reduces the cost of steel production. He integrates his operations vertically, controlling not just the steel mills, but also the coal mines, iron ore deposits, and transportation systems needed to supply them. Most importantly, he drives his workers and managers relentlessly to reduce costs and increase production, believing that in the competitive environment of industrial America, only the most efficient will survive. The results of Carnegie's methods are spectacular. By the 1880s, his steel company is producing more steel than all of Britain, and at prices that make American steel competitive in markets around the world. His personal wealth grows correspondingly. From the modest savings of a railroad employee, Carnegie's fortune expands to rival that of the medieval monarchs he admires in his reading. Yet unlike many of his fellow magnates, Carnegie never loses sight of his humble origins or his belief in the transformative power of education and self-improvement. While Carnegie builds his steel empire in Pittsburgh, another young man is quietly assembling what will become an even more dominant industrial empire centered on a different commodity: oil. John Davison Rockefeller, born in 1839 to a family of modest means in western New York, possesses a temperament perfectly suited to the methodical accumulation of power and wealth. Where Carnegie is expansive and charming, Rockefeller is quiet and calculating. Where Carnegie seeks publicity and admiration, Rockefeller prefers to work behind the scenes, building his empire through careful planning and ruthless execution. Rockefeller's entry into the oil business comes at the perfect moment. The discovery of oil in Pennsylvania in 1859 has created a new industry, but one characterized by wild speculation, boom and bust cycles, and cutthroat competition. Most of the early oil entrepreneurs focus on drilling for oil, but Rockefeller recognizes that the real profits lie not in production, but in refining and distribution. In 1863, he builds his first oil refinery in Cleveland, Ohio, strategically located to take advantage of both rail and water transportation. From the beginning, Rockefeller approaches the oil business with a systematic methodology that sets him apart from his more flamboyant competitors. He studies every aspect of the business, from the technical details of refining to the complexities of transportation and marketing. He reinvests his profits to expand his facilities and improve his processes. Most importantly, he begins to forge the alliances and arrangements that will eventually give him control over the entire oil industry. Rockefeller's strategy for dominating the oil industry is elegantly simple and devastatingly effective. He negotiates secret agreements with the railroads that give him substantial rebates on shipping costs, making it almost impossible for competitors to match his prices. He uses his cost advantages to undersell competitors, often selling oil below cost to drive them out of business. When competitors are sufficiently weakened, he offers to buy them out, usually at prices far below their actual value. Those who refuse to sell often find themselves cut off from markets and supplies, victims of Rockefeller's systematic campaign of economic warfare. By 1870, Rockefeller has incorporated his various business interests as the Standard Oil Company of Ohio. This corporate structure allows him to centralize control while expanding operations across state lines. Over the next decade, Standard Oil systematically acquires its competitors, until by 1880 it controls roughly 90% of America's oil refining capacity. Rockefeller has created not just a large corporation, but something entirely new in American business, a true monopoly with the power to set prices and control markets on a national scale. The wealth that flows from this monopoly position is almost incomprehensible. By the 1890s, Rockefeller's personal fortune exceeds that of most sovereign nations. He builds a mansion on Fifth Avenue in New York that rivals the palaces of European royalty. He acquires vast estates in Ohio and Florida. His charitable contributions, which will eventually total over $500 million, exceed the entire budgets of most states. Yet Rockefeller himself remains remarkably unchanged by his wealth, continuing to live with the frugal habits and religious devotion that characterized his youth. The rise of men like Carnegie and Rockefeller transforms not just American business, but American society itself. Their vast fortunes create a new class of super-rich who live lives of unprecedented luxury and influence. In New York City, Fifth Avenue becomes known as Billionaires' Row, as one palatial mansion after another rises to house the new American aristocracy. These houses, built in styles borrowed from European palaces and castles, represent more than just displays of wealth. They are statements of power and permanence, declarations that their owners have not just made money, but have established themselves as America's new ruling class. The contrast between these palaces and the tenements where most urban Americans live could hardly be more stark. In New York's Lower East Side, immigrant families crowd into dark, airless apartments where entire families sleep in single rooms. The streets teem with pushcart vendors, playing children, and working people struggling to make ends meet. Disease spreads rapidly in these overcrowded conditions, and infant mortality rates remain shockingly high. For many of these urban poor, the American dream seems impossibly distant, visible only in the electric lights that illuminate the mansions of the wealthy. The gap between rich and poor in Gilded Age America grows wider with each passing year. By 1890, the wealthiest 1% of Americans control over half of the nation's wealth, a concentration of resources that would have shocked the founding fathers. Yet this inequality coexists with unprecedented opportunities for those willing and able to seize them. The same economic forces that create vast fortunes for the few also create jobs for millions of ordinary Americans who find in industrial work, however harsh, better prospects than they had known in agricultural societies. The factory system that emerges during the Gilded Age transforms the nature of work itself. In the textile mills of New England, thousands of young women tend machines that produce cloth at a rate that would have amazed their grandmothers. The work is repetitive and dangerous, with machinery that can easily catch loose clothing or unwary fingers. But it offers these women a degree of economic independence that previous generations could not have imagined. Many of these mill girls, as they are called, use their earnings to support families or to save money for marriage and homes of their own. In the steel mills of Pittsburgh and Gary, men work 12-hour shifts in temperatures that regularly exceed 100 degrees Fahrenheit. They tend blast furnaces that burn at over 2,000 degrees, manipulating molten metal with tools that require both skill and courage. Industrial accidents are common and often fatal, yet these jobs pay wages that allow working-class families to aspire to home ownership and education for their children. The steel industry becomes a ladder of advancement for successive waves of immigrants, each group gradually moving up the economic ladder as newer arrivals take over the most dangerous and difficult jobs. The growth of American industry during this period creates demand not just for workers, but for a new class of managers and professionals. The complexity of modern industrial enterprises requires accountants, engineers, lawyers, and administrators in numbers that would have been unimaginable in the pre-industrial era. These middle-class professionals develop their own distinct culture and lifestyle, characterized by suburban homes, professional associations, and a strong commitment to education and self-improvement. The emergence of this professional middle class creates new markets for goods and services that further fuel economic growth. Department stores like Macy's in New York and Marshall Field is in Chicago cater to middle-class consumers who have both the income and the desire to purchase manufactured goods. These stores, with their elaborate window displays and courteous sales staff, transform shopping from a necessity into a form of entertainment and self-expression. The goods they sell, made possible by mass production techniques pioneered in American factories, bring unprecedented comfort and convenience to middle-class homes. The revolution in manufacturing that makes these consumer goods possible owes much to innovations in production methods that emerged during the Gilded Age. The development of interchangeable parts, pioneered in the American firearms industry, allows for mass production of complex machinery and consumer goods. The use of steam power and later electricity transforms the speed and efficiency of manufacturing processes. Perhaps most importantly, American manufacturers developed new methods of organizing production that divide complex tasks into simple, repetitive operations that can be performed by relatively unskilled workers. These innovations in manufacturing are matched by equally revolutionary changes in transportation and communication. The completion of the Transcontinental Railroad is followed by the construction of additional transcontinental lines and thousands of miles of feeder routes that connect even small towns to national markets. The development of refrigerated railroad cars makes it possible to ship perishable goods across vast distances, transforming American agriculture and diet. By 1890, fresh beef from Chicago stockyards can be found in butcher shops from Boston to San Francisco, while fresh fruit from California orchards appears in eastern markets. The communications revolution of the Gilded Age is equally dramatic. The telegraph, which had been primarily a tool of railroads and newspapers before the Civil War, becomes a nationwide network that allows businesses to coordinate operations across vast distances. The invention of the telephone by Alexander Graham Bell in 1876 creates new possibilities for both business and personal communication. By the 1890s, telephone networks connect major cities across the continent, and the distinctive ring of the telephone becomes a familiar sound in offices and middle-class homes. These improvements in transportation and communication create the infrastructure necessary for the emergence of truly national businesses. Companies that had previously operated within regional markets suddenly find themselves able to compete on a continental scale. This expansion of market size creates opportunities for unprecedented economies of scale, but also intensifies competition in ways that smaller local businesses often cannot survive. The most successful entrepreneurs of the Gilded Age are those who best understand how to exploit these new possibilities for large-scale organization and operation. John Pierpont Morgan, born in 1837 to a prosperous banking family, represents perhaps the ultimate expression of this new breed of businessman. Where Carnegie built his fortune through innovation in steel production and Rockefeller through control of oil refining and distribution, Morgan's genius lies in his ability to organize and finance the massive enterprises that the new economy makes possible. Morgan's career begins in the family banking business, but he quickly demonstrates an ability to see financial opportunities that others miss. During the Civil War, he profits from speculative investments in gold and government bonds. After the war, he becomes increasingly involved in railroad finance, helping to reorganize bankrupt lines and arrange mergers between competing companies. His reputation for honesty and competence in an industry notorious for corruption makes him a trusted intermediary for both investors and railroad managers. The Depression of 1873, triggered by the failure of J. Cook and Company, a major investment bank, creates opportunities for Morgan to demonstrate his skills on a national stage. As dozens of railroad companies face bankruptcy, Morgan emerges as the dominant figure in railroad reorganization. His method is straightforward but revolutionary. He eliminates destructive competition by organizing competing lines into larger, more efficient systems. He replaces corrupt or incompetent management with professional administrators. Most importantly, he ensures that reorganized companies have sufficient capital to modernize their equipment and expand their operations. Morgan's success in railroad reorganization establishes him as the most powerful financier in America, but his ambitions extend far beyond railroads. He sees that the industrial economy of the Gilded Age requires new forms of organization and financing that traditional banks and investment houses are poorly equipped to provide. The scale of modern industrial enterprises, with their enormous capital requirements and complex operational challenges, demands financial institutions capable of thinking and acting on a national and international scale. The creation of these new financial institutions transforms the nature of American capitalism itself. Morgan's bank, J.P. Morgan and Company, becomes more than just a source of capital for industrial enterprises. It becomes a coordinating mechanism that helps to organize and rationalize entire industries. When Morgan finances a steel company or railroad, he often places his own representatives on the company's board of directors, ensuring that his influence extends far beyond the provision of capital. This system of interlocking directorates and financial control creates what critics will later call the money trust, a small group of financiers who exercise enormous influence over American industry. The power that Morgan and his fellow financiers accumulate during the Gilded Age extends beyond mere wealth to encompass genuine political and social influence. When the federal government faces a financial crisis in 1895, it is Morgan who organizes a syndicate of private bankers to bail out the Treasury. When industrial disputes threaten to disrupt the economy, it is often Morgan who brokers agreements between labor and management. His personal decisions about which companies to finance and which to refuse can determine the fate of entire industries. This concentration of financial power creates both opportunities and dangers for the American economy. On the positive side, it allows for the mobilization of capital on a scale that makes possible truly gigantic enterprises like the United States Steel Corporation, which Morgan organizes in 1901 as the world's first billion-dollar corporation. On the negative side, it creates the potential for manipulation and abuse that will eventually provoke a political backlash against the power of big business and high finance. The social tensions created by the concentration of wealth and power during the Gilded Age are exacerbated by the harsh working conditions that characterize much of American industry. The 12-hour workday is standard in most industries, and 6-day work weeks are common. Industrial accidents claim thousands of lives each year, and occupational diseases like black lung and lead poisoning shorten the lives of countless workers. For many industrial workers, the American promise of opportunity and advancement seems increasingly hollow as they struggle simply to survive in an economy that appears designed primarily to benefit employers and investors. These conditions create fertile ground for the growth of labor organizations that seek to improve wages and working conditions through collective action. The Knights of Labor, founded in 1869, attempts to organize workers across craft and industry lines into a single powerful union. At its peak in the 1880s, the Knights claim over 700,000 members and successfully conduct strikes that shut down entire railroad systems. However, the organization's broad membership and idealistic goals make it difficult to maintain unity, and a series of failed strikes and internal conflicts lead to its decline by the 1890s. The American Federation of Labor, founded in 1886 under the leadership of Samuel Gompers, takes a more pragmatic approach to labor organization. Rather than seeking to transform the entire economic system, the AFL focuses on specific, achievable goals: higher wages, shorter hours, and better working conditions. By organizing skilled workers along craft lines and avoiding entanglement in broader political causes, the AFL proves more durable than its predecessors. By 1900, it represents over 500,000 workers in unions, ranging from cigar makers to carpenters to iron molders. The struggle between labor and capital during the Gilded Age occasionally erupts into violence that shocks the entire nation. The Great Railroad Strike of 1877 begins as a protest against wage cuts, but quickly spreads across the country as workers in multiple industries join the strike. In Pittsburgh, striking workers clash with state militia, resulting in dozens of deaths and millions of dollars in property damage. The strike is eventually broken by federal troops, but it demonstrates both the power of organized labor and the willingness of government to use force to protect business interests. The Homestead Strike of 1892 at Carnegie's steel plant near Pittsburgh provides an even more dramatic illustration of the tensions between labor and capital. When Carnegie's plant manager, Henry Clay Frick, attempts to break the union by cutting wages and bringing in non-union workers, the union responds by taking control of the plant. Frick hires 300 Pinkerton guards to retake the facility, leading to a pitched battle that leaves 10 people dead and dozens wounded. The strike is eventually broken when the governor of Pennsylvania sends in state militia, but the violence shocks middle-class Americans and raises serious questions about the human cost of industrial progress. The Pullman strike of 1894 demonstrates how labor disputes can quickly escalate into national crises in an interconnected industrial economy. When workers at the Pullman Palace Car Company go on strike to protest wage cuts, the American Railway Union, led by Eugene V. Debs, organizes a sympathy strike that paralyzes railroad traffic throughout the Midwest. President Grover Cleveland sends federal troops to break the strike, citing the need to ensure mail delivery. But critics argue that the government is simply acting as the agent of big business. These labor conflicts reveal deep fissures in American society that the prosperity of the Gilded Age cannot disguise. While industrial growth creates unprecedented wealth for some Americans, it also creates new forms of dependency and vulnerability for others. The traditional American ideal of economic independence, embodied in the figure of the independent farmer or craftsman, becomes increasingly difficult to achieve in an economy dominated by large corporations and industrial production methods. The response of the wealthy to these social tensions varies considerably. Some, like Carnegie, develop elaborate theories about the responsibilities of wealth and engage in massive philanthropic projects. Carnegie's Gospel of Wealth, published in 1889, argues that the rich have a moral obligation to use their fortunes for the betterment of society. He practices what he preaches, eventually giving away over $350 million to build libraries, schools, and cultural institutions. His philanthropic activities help to legitimize great wealth by suggesting that it serves broader social purposes. Others among the wealthy take a more defensive approach, arguing that their success benefits society by creating jobs and promoting economic growth. They point to the millions of immigrants who have found opportunity in American factories and the rising standard of living that industrial production makes possible. From this perspective, attacks on business success are attacks on the very foundations of American prosperity and progress. The political system of the Gilded Age struggles to address these competing claims and interests. The federal government remains relatively weak and limited in its activities compared to later periods, but it is increasingly called upon to referee disputes between different economic groups. The Interstate Commerce Act of 1887, which regulates railroad rates and practices, represents one of the first attempts by the federal government to assert control over big business. The Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890, which prohibits monopolies and restraints on trade, signals growing political concern about the concentration of economic power. However, the enforcement of these early regulatory measures proves sporadic and often ineffective. The Supreme Court interprets the Sherman Act narrowly, applying it more often against labor unions than against business combinations. The Interstate Commerce Commission lacks the resources and authority to effectively regulate the railroad industry. As a result, the concentration of economic power continues largely unabated, setting the stage for more dramatic confrontations in the future. The cultural life of Gilded Age America reflects the tensions and contradictions of rapid industrialization and social change. In the cities, new forms of popular entertainment emerge to serve the growing urban population. Vaudeville theaters, dance halls, and later motion picture houses provide amusement for working-class audiences. Professional baseball becomes the national pastime, while college football develops a passionate following among the middle class. These new forms of entertainment create shared cultural experiences that help to bind together an increasingly diverse society. The wealthy create their own distinct cultural institutions during this period. They build elaborate opera houses, art museums, and private clubs that serve both as displays of refined taste and as mechanisms for maintaining social exclusivity. The Metropolitan Opera House in New York, completed in 1883, becomes a symbol of high culture and social status. The annual social season, with its elaborate balls and dinner parties, creates a ritual calendar that helps to define and maintain elite social networks. The educational system of Gilded Age America undergoes significant expansion and transformation in response to the demands of industrial society. Public schools, previously limited primarily to elementary education, begin to offer secondary education to larger numbers of students. The growth of industry creates demand for workers with technical skills, leading to the establishment of technical schools and institutes. At the same time, established universities expand their offerings, and new universities are founded with endowments from industrial fortunes. The founding of Johns Hopkins University in 1876, with its emphasis on graduate education and scientific research, represents a new model for American higher education. Stanford University, founded in 1885 with funds from railroad baron Leland Stanford, and the University of Chicago, founded in 1892 with Rockefeller money, demonstrate how industrial wealth is transforming the landscape of American education. These institutions not only provide advanced education for the professional and business classes, but also conduct the scientific and technical research that makes continued industrial progress possible. The role of women in Gilded Age society undergoes gradual but significant change as industrial development creates new opportunities and challenges. The growth of clerical work in business and government creates employment opportunities for educated women, leading to the feminization of occupations like teaching, nursing, and office work. The development of department stores and other retail businesses creates additional employment opportunities, though usually at wages significantly lower than those paid to men for comparable work. Upper-class women often find outlets for their energies and talents in philanthropic and reform activities. Organizations like the Women's Christian Temperance Union mobilize thousands of women in campaigns against alcohol consumption and other social evils. The settlement house movement, led by women like Jane Addams, attempts to address the problems of urban poverty through direct service and advocacy. These activities not only address genuine social needs, but also provide women with experience in organization and leadership that will prove valuable in their later campaigns for political rights. The cultural impact of immigration during the Gilded Age extends far beyond its economic effects. Each wave of newcomers brings distinct traditions, languages, and customs that enrich American culture while also creating tensions with earlier arrivals. German immigrants establish breweries, orchestras, and gymnastic societies that become permanent features of American life. Irish immigrants bring musical traditions and political skills that influence both popular culture and urban politics. Italian immigrants introduce new foods and family traditions that gradually become part of mainstream American culture. The process of assimilation is often difficult and painful for immigrant families. Parents struggle to maintain old-world traditions while their children eagerly adopt American ways. Languages are gradually lost as English becomes the language of advancement and success. Religious and cultural practices are modified to fit American conditions. Yet this process of cultural transformation also revitalizes American society, introducing new ideas, customs, and perspectives that help to prevent stagnation and conformity. The impact of industrialization on rural America during the Gilded Age is equally dramatic, though often overlooked in accounts that focus primarily on urban and industrial development. The expansion of railroad networks brings rural areas into closer contact with national markets, creating new opportunities for commercial agriculture while also subjecting farmers to new forms of economic pressure. Farmers who had previously grown primarily for local consumption find themselves competing in national and international markets, where prices fluctuate based on conditions far beyond their control. The mechanization of agriculture, driven by the same technological innovations that transform manufacturing, dramatically increases agricultural productivity while reducing the need for farm labor. The mechanical reaper, the steel plow, and other innovations allow individual farmers to cultivate much larger areas than had previously been possible. This increased productivity helps to feed the growing urban population while also displacing rural workers who migrate to cities in search of industrial employment. The development of commercial agriculture during the Gilded Age creates new forms of regional specialization that bind the national economy together while also creating new vulnerabilities. The wheat fields of Kansas and Nebraska feed the growing cities of the East Coast. The cattle ranches of Texas supply beef to Chicago stockyards for processing and distribution throughout the nation. The cotton fields of the South, worked increasingly by sharecroppers rather than slaves, supply raw materials for textile mills in both North and South. This agricultural transformation is facilitated by the same financial institutions and transportation systems that support industrial development. Railroads not only carry agricultural products to market, but also bring manufactured goods to rural areas, undermining local craft production and making farm families increasingly dependent on purchased goods. Banks and other financial institutions provide the credit necessary for farmers to purchase land, equipment, and supplies, but also subject farmers to the risks of debt and foreclosure when crops fail or prices fall. The cattle industry of the Great Plains represents perhaps the most dramatic example of how industrial capitalism transforms traditional ways of life during the Gilded Age. The great cattle drives that bring Texas longhorns to railroad terminals in Kansas are made possible by the same railroad expansion that supports other forms of economic development. The cowboys who drive these cattle herds become legendary figures in American culture, but their way of life is brief and quickly transformed by the expansion of farming. The introduction of barbed wire and the development of more efficient methods of cattle raising. The mining industry that develops in the mountains of the American West during this period demonstrates both the opportunities and the dangers of rapid economic development. The discovery of gold, silver, copper, and other minerals creates instant boom towns that spring up almost overnight in previously uninhabited areas. Fortunes are made and lost with stunning rapidity as miners, speculators, and merchants rush to exploit newly discovered deposits. These mining communities often exhibit the social tensions and inequalities that characterize industrial development throughout America during the Gilded Age. A few successful mine owners accumulate vast wealth, while most miners work for wages under dangerous conditions. The Comstock Lode in Nevada makes millionaires of men like James Fair and John Mackay, while thousands of miners risk their lives daily in underground workings that frequently collapse or flood. Similar patterns emerge in the copper mines of Montana, the gold fields of Colorado, and the coal mines of Wyoming. The development of the American West during the Gilded Age also involves the systematic displacement and suppression of Native American peoples whose traditional ways of life are incompatible with industrial capitalism and commercial agriculture. The construction of transcontinental railroads facilitates not only economic development, but also military campaigns that force Native Americans onto increasingly restricted reservations. The slaughter of the buffalo herds that had supported Plains Indian culture is accomplished with industrial efficiency, using rifles and systematic hunting methods that destroy an entire ecosystem within a few decades. The Indian Wars that raged throughout the American West during the Gilded Age represent the violent edge of American expansion and development. Conflicts like Little Bighorn in 1876 and Wounded Knee in 1890 demonstrate the lengths to which the federal government will go to clear the way for economic development. The reservation system that emerges from these conflicts confines Native Americans to marginal lands while opening vast territories to mining, ranching, and farming operations that generate enormous profits for investors and corporations based primarily in eastern cities. As the 1880s unfold, the contradictions and tensions inherent in America is rapid industrial transformation become increasingly apparent to observers both foreign and domestic. European visitors to America during this period are simultaneously impressed by the nation's energy and productivity and appalled by the extremes of wealth and poverty they encounter. The same country that produces architectural marvels like the Brooklyn Bridge, completed in 1883 after 14 years of construction, also tolerates slum conditions that rival the worst found in European industrial cities. The Brooklyn Bridge itself serves as a powerful symbol of both the achievements and the human costs of Gilded Age development. This engineering masterpiece, spanning the East River between Manhattan and Brooklyn, demonstrates American technical prowess and ambition on a scale that commands international attention. Yet its construction claims over 30 lives, including that of its original designer, John Roebling, who dies from tetanus after his foot is crushed while surveying the bridge site. His son, Washington Roebling, takes over the project, but is later incapacitated by decompression sickness contracted while working in the underwater caissons that support the bridge's towers. The completion of the bridge falls to Washington Roebling's wife, Emily Warren Roebling, who becomes the first woman to serve as chief engineer on a major construction project. Her role in completing the Brooklyn Bridge challenges conventional assumptions about women's capabilities, while also highlighting the informal ways in which women often assume responsibility for important work without receiving formal recognition or authority. The bridge opens to great fanfare in 1883, with President Chester A. Arthur and other dignitaries in attendance, but the celebration cannot obscure the fact that this magnificent structure was built through the sacrifice of working-class lives. The concentration of wealth and power that characterizes the Gilded Age becomes increasingly visible in the great cities that serve as headquarters for America's industrial empires. New York City, already the nation's largest city and primary port, emerges during this period as the undisputed capital of American finance and commerce. The construction of ever-taller office buildings in Lower Manhattan creates the world's first true skyscraper district, where the headquarters of railroad companies, banks, and industrial corporations tower over the narrow streets in concrete demonstrations of corporate power. The development of Central Park, completed during the 1870s, provides New York's wealthy elite with a carefully designed natural landscape that offers relief from the intensity of urban life, while also serving as a stage for the display of wealth and fashion. On any pleasant afternoon, the park's carriage drives fill with elaborate equipages, carrying the city's social leaders on carefully choreographed parades of conspicuous consumption. The contrast between these displays of luxury and the overcrowded tenements that house most of the city's population could hardly be more stark. Chicago, rebuilt after the devastating fire of 1871, emerges as the great metropolis of the American interior, serving as the hub for the railroad networks that bind the continent together and the processing center for the agricultural and mineral wealth of the West. The city's rapid growth from a frontier town to a major metropolis within a single generation exemplifies the transformative power of industrial capitalism, while also highlighting its disruptive effects on traditional communities and ways of life. The stockyards of Chicago become perhaps the most powerful symbol of industrial efficiency and its human costs during the Gilded Age. These vast facilities, covering hundreds of acres on the city's south side, process millions of cattle, hogs and sheep each year with assembly line methods that reduce the slaughter and processing of animals to a series of precisely timed operations. Workers in these plants, many of them recent immigrants from Eastern Europe, perform the same repetitive tasks hour after hour, day after day, in conditions that are both dangerous and dehumanizing. The efficiency of the Chicago stockyards revolutionizes the American diet by making fresh meat available at reasonable prices throughout the country, but this achievement comes at a terrible cost in human terms. Industrial accidents are common, with workers regularly injured by machinery, scalded by steam, or sickened by exposure to chemicals and disease. The neighborhoods surrounding the stockyards become some of the most polluted and unhealthy in America, with air and water contaminated by the waste products of industrial meat processing. The living conditions in these industrial neighborhoods reflect the broader pattern of inequality that characterizes Gilded Age cities. While the wealthy retreat to fashionable districts with tree-lined streets and spacious homes, working-class families crowd into tenements where multiple families often share single rooms. These buildings, hastily constructed to house the flood of immigrants and rural migrants who pour into the cities seeking industrial employment, lack adequate ventilation, sanitation, or privacy. The contrast between wealth and poverty in Gilded Age cities becomes a subject of increasing concern for social reformers and journalists who document the conditions in which most urban Americans live. Jacob Riis, a Danish immigrant who becomes a police reporter for New York newspapers, pioneers the use of photography to document tenement conditions in works that shock middle-class readers with their graphic depiction of urban poverty. His book, How the Other Half Lives, published in 1890, provides detailed descriptions of overcrowded apartments where entire families sleep in single rooms and children grow up without ever seeing sunlight or breathing fresh air. These documentations of urban poverty begin to challenge the comfortable assumption among the wealthy that their success is simply the natural result of superior talent and effort. The growing body of evidence about working and living conditions in industrial America makes it increasingly difficult to maintain that the poor deserve their fate, or that the economic system automatically rewards virtue and punishes vice. Social critics begin to argue that the extreme inequality of the Gilded Age reflects not natural law, but the systematic exploitation of workers by employers who possess overwhelming advantages in wealth and power. The response of the wealthy to these criticisms varies considerably, but many develop elaborate theoretical justifications for inequality that draw upon contemporary interpretations of evolutionary theory. Social Darwinism, as popularized by figures like Herbert Spencer and William Graham Sumner, argues that economic competition serves the same function in human society that natural selection serves in the biological world. From this perspective, the success of men like Carnegie, Rockefeller, and Morgan demonstrates their superior fitness, while the poverty of workers and immigrants reflects their inability to compete effectively in the struggle for existence. These theories provide intellectual respectability for practices that might otherwise appear simply selfish or cruel, but they also provoke counter-arguments from critics who question both their scientific validity and their moral implications. Religious leaders, in particular, often challenge social Darwinist interpretations by pointing to Christian teachings about charity and social responsibility. The social gospel movement, which emerges during the 1880s and 1890s, argues that Christians have a duty to address social problems rather than simply accepting them as natural and inevitable. The political system of the Gilded Age struggles to address the growing tensions between capital and labor, while maintaining the democratic institutions that supposedly guarantee equal rights for all citizens. The reality of political life during this period, however, often falls far short of democratic ideals. Political machines in major cities like New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia control elections through combinations of patronage, corruption, and intimidation that make genuine popular participation difficult, if not impossible. Tammany Hall, the democratic political machine that dominates New York City politics throughout the Gilded Age, exemplifies both the corruption and the crude effectiveness of machine politics. Under the leadership of William M. Tweed in the 1860s and 1870s, Tammany systematically loots the city treasury through inflated contracts, kickbacks, and outright theft that costs taxpayers millions of dollars. Yet Tammany also provides essential services to immigrant communities, helping newcomers find jobs, housing, and assistance in navigating the complexities of urban life. The exposure of Tammany corruption by newspaper crusades and reform movements leads to periodic efforts at political cleanup, but these reforms often prove short-lived. The underlying conditions that make machine politics attractive to voters, the need for jobs, services, and protection from an often hostile environment, remain unchanged. Moreover, the business interests that profit from municipal contracts and favorable legislation often prefer dealing with corrupt but reliable political organizations rather than reform movements that might prove less predictable or accommodating. The relationship between big business and government during the Gilded Age becomes increasingly complex as the scale and influence of corporate enterprise expand. Railroad companies in particular develop sophisticated lobbying operations that maintain agents in state capitals and in Washington to ensure favorable legislation and to prevent hostile regulation. The techniques of corporate influence peddling that emerged during this period, campaign contributions, lobbying, the hiring of former officials, establish patterns that will persist throughout American history. The Credit Mobilier scandal of 1872-1873 provides a dramatic illustration of how corporate influence corrupts the political process. The Union Pacific Railroad creates a construction company, Credit Mobilier of America, which receives vastly inflated contracts for building portions of the Transcontinental Railroad. To prevent congressional investigation of these arrangements, the company distributes shares of stock to prominent congressmen and other federal officials. When the scandal finally becomes public, it destroys several political careers and provides ammunition for critics who argue that the American government has been captured by corporate interests. Similar scandals emerge at the state level as railroad companies and other corporations use bribery and corruption to secure favorable legislation. The Standard Oil Company develops particularly sophisticated methods for influencing state governments, maintaining networks of lobbyists and agents who monitor proposed legislation and intervene when necessary to protect the company's interests. These activities are conducted with such efficiency and thoroughness that Standard Oil often knows more about proposed legislation than the legislators themselves. The corruption of democratic institutions by corporate money and influence provokes the emergence of reform movements that seek to restore popular control over government. The Mugwump movement of the 1880s, composed primarily of educated middle-class reformers, advocates civil service reform, honest elections, and the elimination of political corruption. While these reformers achieve some successes, particularly in civil service reform, they often struggle to build popular support for their programs among working-class voters who benefit from machine politics. The populist movement that emerges in the 1880s and 1890s represents a more radical challenge to the political and economic arrangements of the Gilded Age. Drawing its support primarily from farmers in the South and West who have been squeezed by falling crop prices and rising transportation costs, populism advocates fundamental changes in the American economic system. Populists call for government ownership of railroads and telegraphs, the direct election of senators, a graduated income tax, and the free coinage of silver to increase the money supply and make it easier for debtors to repay their obligations. The populist critique of Gilded Age capitalism extends beyond specific policy proposals to challenge the fundamental assumptions that justify extreme inequality and corporate power. Populist speakers and writers argue that the concentration of wealth in the hands of a few threatens democratic institutions and the traditional American ideal of equality of opportunity. They point to the power of railroad companies to set freight rates, the ability of banks to control credit, and the influence of corporations over government as evidence that American democracy is being destroyed by plutocracy. The response of established political and business leaders to populist challenges reveals the extent to which they have become committed to defending existing arrangements against any significant change. Populist candidates and ideas are denounced as dangerous radicalism that threatens the foundations of American prosperity and progress. Business leaders argue that any significant government intervention in the economy will discourage investment and innovation, leading to economic stagnation and decline. The election of 1896 becomes a crucial test of whether the populist challenge can attract enough support to transform American politics. William Jennings Bryan, the Democratic candidate who adopts much of the populist platform, campaigns across the country with a message that frames the election as a struggle between the producing masses and the idle holders of idle capital. His famous Cross of Gold speech at the Democratic National Convention electrifies delegates with its passionate denunciation of the gold standard and its defense of farmers and workers against the power of Eastern financiers. The campaign of 1896 mobilizes both sides in the political struggle with unprecedented intensity and resources. Bryan conducts an exhausting speaking campaign that takes him to virtually every state in the Union, while his Republican opponent, William McKinley, conducts a more traditional front porch campaign from his home in Ohio. Business leaders, terrified by the prospect of Bryan's election, contribute millions of dollars to McKinley's campaign and organize a massive publicity effort to convince voters that Democratic victory would mean economic disaster. McKinley's victory in 1896 represents a crucial turning point in American political development, demonstrating that the existing economic and political arrangements enjoy sufficient popular support to survive even serious challenges. The defeat of Bryan and the populist agenda shows that most Americans, despite their concerns about inequality and corporate power, are not yet ready to embrace fundamental changes in the economic system. This electoral verdict provides reassurance to business leaders that their position is secure and that they need not fear serious political interference with their activities. The Spanish-American War of 1898 provides further evidence of America's emergence as a major industrial power, while also demonstrating how military conflict can serve to distract attention from domestic problems. The brief conflict with Spain results in American acquisition of the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam, making the United States a colonial power for the first time. The war also provides opportunities for American businesses to expand into new markets and for the federal government to demonstrate its organizational capabilities. The mobilization of American industry for the Spanish-American War showcases the productive capacity that has been built during the Gilded Age, while also revealing some of the problems associated with rapid industrial growth. American factories proved capable of producing vast quantities of weapons, ammunition, and other military supplies with remarkable speed. But quality control problems and profiteering by contractors create scandals that echo the corruption of civilian politics. The period following the Spanish-American War sees continued growth in the scale and influence of American corporations, but also growing concern about the concentration of economic power. The formation of United States Steel in 1901, with a capitalization of over $1 billion, creates the world's largest corporation and demonstrates the extent to which American industry has become dominated by giant enterprises. The involvement of J.P. Morgan in organizing this corporate giant highlights the crucial role that financial institutions play in the modern economy, while also raising questions about the accountability of such powerful institutions. The merger movement that creates United States Steel is part of a broader trend toward corporate consolidation that accelerates during the late 1890s and early 1900s. Industries ranging from steel and oil to sugar and tobacco witness the formation of giant corporations through mergers and acquisitions that eliminate competition and create near monopolistic control over entire markets. These developments represent the logical culmination of trends that have been building throughout the Gilded Age, but they also create new political and economic challenges that will require new responses. The labor movement adapts to these changing conditions by developing new strategies and organizations designed to deal with the realities of corporate consolidation. The Industrial Workers of the World, founded in 1905, attempts to organize workers across industry lines into one big union, capable of challenging corporate power on its own terms. While the IWW never achieves the mass membership of more conservative unions, it represents an important alternative vision of labor organization based on industrial rather than craft principles. The continuing struggles between labor and capital during this period produce some of the most violent and dramatic conflicts in American history. The Ludlow Massacre of 1914, in which Colorado National Guard troops fire on a tent colony of striking coal miners, killing women and children, shocks the nation and provides powerful ammunition for critics of corporate power. The involvement of the Rockefeller family in the Colorado coal industry makes this tragedy particularly damaging to the reputation of America's industrial elite. These labor conflicts highlight the extent to which violence has become an integral part of industrial relations during the Gilded Age. Both sides in labor disputes routinely resort to force, with employers hiring private security forces and strikebreakers, while unions organize picket lines and sometimes engage in sabotage. The frequent intervention of state and federal military forces on the side of employers creates a pattern of government support for business interests that reinforces labor's conviction that the political system is fundamentally biased against working people. The urban environment that emerges during the Gilded Age reflects both the opportunities and the problems created by rapid industrial development. Cities like New York, Chicago, and Pittsburgh grow with breathtaking speed, creating new forms of architecture, transportation, and social organization, while also generating pollution, congestion, and social problems on an unprecedented scale. The development of electric lighting, streetcar systems, and telephone networks transforms urban life while also creating new forms of inequality between those who can afford these modern conveniences and those who cannot. The emergence of department stores during this period revolutionizes retail commerce while also creating new forms of employment and consumer culture. Stores like Macy's in New York, Marshall Field's in Chicago, and Wanamaker's in Philadelphia become virtual cities within cities, employing thousands of workers and attracting customers from across entire metropolitan areas. These establishments introduce new concepts of customer service, product display, and marketing that transform shopping from a necessity into a form of entertainment and self-expression. The growth of consumer culture during the Gilded Age creates new opportunities for social mobility and personal expression, while also generating new forms of social pressure and anxiety. The proliferation of manufactured goods makes it possible for middle-class families to acquire possessions and comforts that had previously been available only to the wealthy. But it also creates new standards of material success that can be difficult to achieve. The emergence of advertising as a major industry reflects the growing importance of consumer goods in American life, while also demonstrating how business interests shape cultural values and aspirations. The development of mass media during this period plays a crucial role in creating national markets for consumer goods, while also shaping public opinion about political and social issues. The growth of newspaper circulation, facilitated by improved printing technology and transportation networks, makes it possible for news and information to spread more rapidly than ever before. Publishers like Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst pioneer new forms of journalism that combine sensational reporting with aggressive marketing techniques, creating the first truly mass media in American history. The influence of mass media on American culture during the Gilded Age extends far beyond simple news reporting to encompass entertainment, advertising, and the creation of shared cultural experiences. The serialization of novels in newspapers and magazines makes literature available to vast audiences while also creating new forms of popular fiction designed specifically for mass consumption. The development of national magazines creates shared cultural references and standards that help to bind together an increasingly diverse society, while also creating new opportunities for the marketing of consumer goods. The educational system that develops during the Gilded Age reflects the changing needs of an industrial society, while also perpetuating and legitimizing existing social hierarchies. The expansion of public education creates new opportunities for individual advancement, while also providing business and industry with the skilled workforce they require. However, the structure and content of education often reinforce class distinctions by providing different types of training for different social groups. Elite private schools and universities continue to serve the children of wealthy families, while also providing training for the professional and managerial classes that serve corporate interests. The curriculum at these institutions emphasizes classical learning, cultural refinement, and social connections rather than technical training, reflecting the belief that true leadership requires broad cultural knowledge rather than narrow specialization. The social networks created at elite educational institutions become crucial mechanisms for maintaining upper-class cohesion and influence across generations. Public schools, by contrast, focus increasingly on providing basic literacy and numeracy, along with training in industrial discipline and social conformity. The development of age-graded classrooms, standardized curricula, and bureaucratic administration mirrors the organizational methods being developed in business and industry. These changes make public education more efficient and systematic, while also making schools into institutions that prepare students for their roles as workers in an industrial economy. The cultural productions of the Gilded Age reflect both the aspirations and the anxieties generated by rapid social and economic change. Literature, art, and music during this period often focus on themes of success and failure, social mobility and class conflict, tradition and modernity. Writers like William Dean Howells, Theodore Dreiser, and Frank Norris create works that examine the human costs of industrialization while also celebrating the energy and dynamism of American life. The visual arts during the Gilded Age demonstrate similar tensions between celebration and criticism of contemporary developments. Painters like Thomas Eakins and Winslow Homer create realistic portrayals of American life that often focus on working people and everyday experiences rather than the idealized subjects preferred by earlier artists. At the same time, wealthy patrons commission elaborate portraits and decorative works that celebrate their success and reinforce their social status. Architecture during this period reflects the growing wealth and ambition of American elites, while also demonstrating the influence of new technologies and materials. The great mansions built by industrial fortunes in cities like New York and Newport represent attempts to create American versions of European aristocratic architecture, complete with elaborate gardens and art collections. These houses serve both as comfortable residences and as statements of their owners' cultural sophistication and social position. The development of skyscraper architecture in cities like Chicago and New York represents a distinctly American contribution to world architecture, made possible by new technologies like steel frame construction and electric elevators. These buildings demonstrate American technical prowess and commercial energy while also creating new forms of urban experience. The concentration of business activity in tall office buildings transforms the rhythm and character of city life while also creating new forms of social interaction and hierarchy. The religious life of Gilded Age America reflects the challenges that rapid social change poses to traditional beliefs and institutions. Established Protestant denominations struggle to address the problems of industrial society while maintaining their theological integrity and social respectability. The social gospel movement represents one attempt to make Christianity relevant to contemporary social problems, but it often encounters resistance from both conservative members who prefer traditional religious focuses and radical critics who view religious institutions as allies of the status quo. The growth of urban populations creates new challenges for religious institutions, while also providing new opportunities for religious innovation. Urban churches experiment with new forms of programming and outreach, designed to address the needs of working-class congregations and immigrant communities. The Salvation Army and similar organizations develop new approaches to combining religious evangelism with social service that prove particularly effective in urban environments. The immigrant communities that form such a large part of urban populations during the Gilded Age often maintain their own religious institutions and traditions while also adapting to American conditions. Catholic parishes, Jewish synagogues, and other religious institutions serve not only spiritual needs, but also important social and economic functions for immigrant communities. These institutions provide networks of mutual support, educational opportunities, and cultural preservation that help immigrants maintain their identities while also facilitating their integration into American society. The scientific and technological innovations that drive industrial development during the Gilded Age also challenge traditional religious and philosophical beliefs about the nature of humanity and society. The theory of evolution, as popularized by Charles Darwin and his followers, raises fundamental questions about human origins and destiny that many find difficult to reconcile with traditional religious teachings. The application of scientific methods to social problems suggests that human society, like the natural world, operates according to discoverable laws that can be manipulated to achieve desired results. These intellectual developments contribute to growing secularization of American culture, while also provoking defensive reactions from religious conservatives. The conflict between science and religion that emerges during this period creates lasting divisions within American society while also stimulating new forms of intellectual inquiry and cultural expression. Universities and other educational institutions become battlegrounds where different worldviews compete for influence and support. The international implications of America's industrial transformation become increasingly apparent during the later years of the Gilded Age, as American businesses begin to compete in global markets and American political leaders assert greater influence in international affairs. The growth of American manufacturing creates surplus production that requires foreign outlets, while the development of American transportation and communication networks facilitates international commerce on an unprecedented scale. American agricultural products, particularly wheat and cotton, begin to compete effectively in European markets, disrupting traditional patterns of international trade while also creating new forms of economic interdependence. The efficiency of American industrial production methods attracts international attention and imitation, while also creating competitive pressures that force other nations to modernize their own economies or risk being left behind. The emergence of America as a major industrial power also creates new military and strategic capabilities that transform the nation's role in international affairs. The Spanish-American War demonstrates that American industry can support military operations far from the nation's borders, while also showing that American military technology has reached world-class standards. The construction of the Panama Canal, begun during this period, represents both a remarkable engineering achievement and a demonstration of American willingness to use its industrial and financial resources to reshape the global environment. The cultural influence of Gilded Age America begins to extend beyond national borders, as American innovations in technology, business organization, and popular culture attract international attention. The efficiency of American industrial methods, the scale of American enterprises, and the energy of American cities become subjects of fascination and study for observers from around the world. At the same time, American cultural productions begin to find audiences in other countries, creating the first glimmers of the global influence that American popular culture will eventually achieve. The social and economic patterns established during the Gilded Age create legacies that will shape American development for generations to come. The concentration of wealth and power in the hands of a relatively small elite establishes precedents that will influence American politics and economics throughout the 20th century and beyond. The techniques of corporate organization and control developed during this period provide models that will be adapted and refined by later generations of business leaders. The labor relations patterns that emerged during the Gilded Age also create lasting influences on American social and political development. The adversarial relationship between workers and employers that characterizes this period establishes expectations and institutions that will persist long after the specific conditions that created them have changed. The role of government in mediating between competing economic interests, while limited during the Gilded Age itself, expands significantly in later periods, as the problems created by industrial capitalism require increasingly sophisticated political responses. The urban development patterns established during the Gilded Age create physical and social environments that continue to shape American life. The concentration of commercial and industrial activity in downtown areas, the segregation of residential areas by class and ethnicity, and the development of transportation systems that reinforce these patterns create urban forms that persist despite later efforts at reform and reconstruction. The cultural values and aspirations that emerge during the Gilded Age also prove remarkably durable, continuing to influence American attitudes towards success, wealth, and social mobility long after the specific historical circumstances that created them have passed. The belief that individual effort and talent can overcome any obstacle, the conviction that material success indicates moral worth, and the assumption that economic growth necessarily benefits all members of society become fundamental elements of American ideology that persist despite periodic challenges and revisions. As the 19th century draws to a close, the United States that emerges from the transformation of the Gilded Age bears little resemblance to the agricultural republic envisioned by the Founding Fathers. In less than 40 years, the nation has evolved from a predominantly rural society devastated by civil war into the world's leading industrial power. This transformation has created unprecedented wealth and opportunity, while also generating new forms of inequality and social conflict that will challenge American institutions and values for generations to come. The great fortunes accumulated during this period by Carnegie in steel, Rockefeller in oil, Morgan in finance, and dozens of other entrepreneurs in industries ranging from railroads to sugar to tobacco represent not just personal success stories, but fundamental changes in the nature of economic power and social organization. These men and their enterprises have created new forms of corporate capitalism that operate on scales previously unimaginable, while also generating social and political problems that existing institutions are poorly equipped to address. The millions of immigrants who have provided much of the labor for America's industrial transformation have created a society more diverse and complex than any in previous American history. Their struggles to maintain cultural identities while adapting to American conditions, their conflicts with earlier immigrant groups and native-born Americans, and their efforts to improve their economic and social positions have redefined what it means to be American, while also creating new forms of social tension and political conflict. The workers who have built America's industrial infrastructure, laying railroad tracks across the continent, digging coal from dangerous mines, tending machines in textile mills, and steel plants processing meat in Chicago stockyards, have created the physical foundation for modern American prosperity, while often receiving only a small share of the wealth they have created. Their efforts to organize unions, conduct strikes, and improve their working conditions have established patterns of labor relations that will influence American social and political development for generations. The cities that have grown with stunning rapidity during this period, New York, Chicago, Pittsburgh, Detroit, and dozens of others, have become centers of innovation and opportunity, while also becoming sites of poverty, corruption, and environmental degradation. The technologies that have made this urban growth possible, steel frame construction, electric lighting, telephone communication, mass transit, have created new forms of human experience, while also generating new problems that will require innovative solutions. The political institutions that have struggled to cope with the challenges of rapid industrialization have been tested in ways that the Founding Fathers never anticipated. The corruption of democratic processes by corporate money and influence the use of government power to support business interests against workers and consumers, and the growing gap between democratic ideals and political reality have created crises of legitimacy that will require fundamental reforms to resolve. As Americans prepare to enter the 20th century, they face choices that will determine whether the promise of the Gilded Age, unprecedented prosperity and opportunity, can be realized without accepting its costs. Extreme inequality, environmental degradation, and the corruption of democratic institutions. The industrial capacity created during this period provides the foundation for future prosperity. But the social and political problems generated by rapid development require new approaches to governance and social organization. The legacy of the Gilded Age thus presents both opportunities and challenges for future generations of Americans. The productive capacity, technological innovation, and organizational capabilities developed during this period provide tools that can be used to create unprecedented prosperity and opportunity for all Americans. However, realizing this potential will require addressing the fundamental problems of inequality, corporate power, and democratic governance that the Gilded Age has created but not resolved. The closing years of the 19th century witness a series of events that both culminate the Gilded Age transformation and point toward America's emergence as a global power. The Spanish-American War of 1898, fought ostensibly to liberate Cuba from Spanish colonial rule, becomes the vehicle through which the United States announces its arrival on the world stage as an imperial power. This brief but decisive conflict demonstrates the industrial and military capabilities that America has developed during the preceding decades, while also revealing new ambitions that extend far beyond the North American continent. The origins of the Spanish-American War lie partly in genuine humanitarian concerns about Spanish treatment of Cuban revolutionaries, but they also reflect the growing confidence and ambition of American political and business leaders who have witnessed their nation's transformation into an industrial giant. The war is promoted and sensationalized by newspaper publishers like William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer, whose circulation war drives them to ever more dramatic coverage of Spanish atrocities in Cuba. The explosion of the battleship Maine in Havana Harbor in February 1898 provides the immediate catalyst for war, though the cause of the explosion remains disputed. The mobilization for war reveals both the strengths and weaknesses of America's industrial system. American factories prove capable of rapidly increasing production of weapons, ammunition, and other military supplies, demonstrating the productive capacity that has been built during the Gilded Age. However, problems with quality control, logistics, and military organization create scandals that echo the corruption and inefficiency that characterize many aspects of Gilded Age society. More American soldiers die from disease and contaminated food than from enemy action, revealing the persistent gap between American industrial capabilities and administrative competence. Despite these problems, American forces achieve rapid and decisive victory over Spanish colonial forces in both Cuba and the Philippines. The technological advantages provided by American industry, superior weapons, communications equipment, and transportation prove overwhelming against Spanish forces that represent the declining remnants of a pre-industrial imperial system. The Treaty of Paris, signed in December 1898, cedes the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam to the United States, while granting independence to Cuba under American protection. The acquisition of overseas territories transforms the United States from a continental republic into a global empire, creating new opportunities and responsibilities that will profoundly influence American development in the 20th century. The decision to retain control of the Philippines proves particularly controversial, leading to a brutal war of conquest that lasts from 1899 to 1902 and costs thousands of American and Filipino lives. This conflict provides the first major test of American willingness to use its industrial and military power to control distant territories and peoples. The Philippine-American War reveals the darker implications of America as newfound global power, while also demonstrating the extent to which imperial ambitions have become integrated into American thinking about the nation's destiny. Military leaders employ tactics of systematic destruction and population control that prefigure later counterinsurgency campaigns, while political leaders justify American rule in terms that combine humanitarian rhetoric with assertions of racial and cultural superiority. The resistance of Filipino independence fighters, led by figures like Emilio Aguinaldo, provides a sobering reminder that industrial and military superiority do not automatically ensure political control or popular acceptance. The economic implications of American overseas expansion prove as significant as the military and political consequences. The acquisition of new territories provides American businesses with protected markets and sources of raw materials, while also creating new opportunities for investment and development. Sugar companies establish plantations in Hawaii and Puerto Rico, mining companies explore opportunities in the Philippines, and trading companies seek to expand American commerce throughout the Pacific. These developments integrate American business more deeply into global economic networks, while also creating new forms of dependency and exploitation. The Spanish-American War coincides with another development that symbolically marks the end of one era of American history and the beginning of another, the closing of the American frontier. The census of 1890 officially declares that the frontier line, which had moved steadily westward for over 2 centuries, no longer exists as a distinct geographical feature. This statistical milestone, popularized by historian Frederick Jackson Turner in his influential 1893 essay on the significance of the frontier in American history, suggests that a fundamental chapter in American development has closed. The closing of the frontier represents more than just the completion of continental settlement. It symbolizes the end of the seemingly unlimited opportunities for individual advancement that had characterized American society since colonial times. The availability of free or cheap land had provided a safety valve for social tensions, while also reinforcing American beliefs about individual opportunity and social mobility. With the frontier closed, Americans must confront the reality that future development will occur within fixed geographical boundaries and increasingly complex social and economic structures. The implications of the closed frontier become apparent in the growing intensity of social and economic conflicts during the 1890s. Without the option of moving west to start over, workers and farmers find themselves more directly confronted with the power of corporations and the limitations of democratic institutions. The populist movement of the 1890s represents partly a response to this new reality, as rural Americans seek political solutions to problems that previous generations might have addressed through geographical mobility. The industrial cities that have grown rapidly during the Gilded Age now contain millions of Americans who have no realistic prospect of returning to agricultural life or of finding new opportunities on the frontier. These urban populations become increasingly dependent on industrial employment, while also becoming more aware of their collective power as workers and voters. The labor conflicts of the 1890s reflect this new reality as workers organize on an unprecedented scale to challenge corporate power and demand better working conditions and wages. The concentration of population in urban areas also creates new forms of political organization and cultural expression that will shape American society throughout the 20th century. Urban political machines develop sophisticated methods for mobilizing immigrant votes while providing essential services that government agencies fail to deliver. Urban newspapers, theaters, and other cultural institutions create new forms of mass entertainment and communication that gradually spread throughout American society. The technological innovations that continue to emerge during the closing years of the Gilded Age further accelerate the pace of social and economic change. The development of electric power systems transforms both industrial production and domestic life, making possible new forms of manufacturing while also bringing electric lighting and appliances to middle-class homes. The invention of the automobile, while still in its infancy during the 1890s, points toward transportation revolution that will reshape American society even more dramatically than the railroad revolution of the mid-19th century. Thomas Edison, whose laboratories in Menlo Park and West Orange, New Jersey, become synonymous with American technological innovation, exemplifies the marriage of scientific research and commercial development that characterizes Gilded Age progress. Edison's systematic approach to invention, employing teams of skilled technicians and abundant capital to develop practical applications for scientific discoveries, creates a model for industrial research that will be copied and refined throughout the 20th century. His development of practical electric lighting, phonograph recording, and motion pictures demonstrates how technological innovation can create entirely new industries while transforming existing ones. The emergence of motion pictures during the 1890s provides a particularly significant example of how technological innovation creates new forms of cultural expression and commercial opportunity. Early film producers like Thomas Edison and the Lumiere brothers in France recognized that moving pictures can provide mass entertainment on an unprecedented scale, while also serving commercial and educational purposes. The first movie theaters, which begin appearing in major cities during the late 1890s, attract diverse audiences who share common experiences in ways that previous forms of entertainment could not achieve. The development of modern communication technologies during this period also facilitates the emergence of truly national markets and cultural experiences. The expansion of telegraph networks allows businesses to coordinate operations across vast distances, while newspapers can obtain and distribute news from around the world with unprecedented speed. The invention of the telephone creates new possibilities for personal and business communication, while also beginning to transform the pace and character of daily life. These technological developments interact with the social and economic changes of the Gilded Age to create new forms of American culture that combine traditional values with modern innovations. The emergence of professional sports, particularly baseball, creates shared cultural experiences that help bind together an increasingly diverse society. The development of national magazines and book publishing creates markets for literature and journalism that address distinctly American themes and concerns. The literature of the late Gilded Age reflects both celebration of American achievement and growing concern about the social costs of rapid development. Writers like Mark Twain, whose 1873 novel The Gilded Age gives the period its name, use humor and satire to expose the corruption and materialism that characterize contemporary society. Theodore Dreiser's novels explore the moral ambiguities of urban life, while celebrating the energy and possibility of American cities. Henry James examines the cultural tensions between American energy and European sophistication in works that reveal both the achievements and limitations of American civilization. The visual arts during this period similarly reflect the tensions and possibilities of American society. The Ashcan school of painters, emerging during the 1890s and early 1900s, creates realistic portrayals of urban life that focus on working-class subjects and everyday experiences rather than the idealized themes preferred by earlier American artists. At the same time, American collectors begin to acquire European masterpieces on an unprecedented scale, creating art museums and private collections that rival those of European capitals. Architecture during the late Gilded Age continues to reflect both American ambition and cultural insecurity. The World's Columbian Exposition, held in Chicago in 1893 to commemorate the 400th anniversary of Columbus's arrival in America, showcases American achievement in a setting that deliberately evokes classical European architecture. The White City, created for the exposition, demonstrates American organizational and technical capabilities, while also revealing the extent to which American cultural leaders remain influenced by European standards and traditions. The exposition itself becomes a powerful symbol of American progress and possibility, attracting over 27 million visitors who experienced technological marvels like electric lighting, moving sidewalks, and the first Ferris wheel. The fair's celebration of American achievement coincides with one of the worst economic depressions in American history, creating a stark contrast between the optimistic vision of progress displayed at the exposition and the harsh realities experienced by millions of unemployed Americans. The Panic of 1893 and the Depression that follows provide a sobering reminder that the prosperity of the Gilded Age remains vulnerable to economic cycles and financial manipulation. The failure of major railroad companies, the collapse of bank lending, and the widespread unemployment that results from the Depression demonstrate that the industrial economy, for all its productive capacity, has not eliminated economic instability or insecurity. The Depression particularly affects farmers and industrial workers who lack the resources to weather extended periods of unemployment or reduced income. The response to the Depression reveals both the limitations of existing government institutions and the growing demands for political intervention in economic affairs. President Grover Cleveland's adherence to limited government principles prevents effective federal response to the crisis, while state and local governments lack the resources and authority to address problems of national scope. The march of Coxey's army from Ohio to Washington in 1894, demanding federal public works programs to provide employment for the unemployed, symbolizes growing popular expectations that government should take responsibility for economic welfare. The Depression also intensifies the labor conflicts that characterize the 1890s, as employers use unemployment to justify wage cuts and attacks on union organization. The Pullman strike of 1894, which spreads from Chicago throughout the Midwest as railroad workers support striking Pullman employees, demonstrates both the power of organized labor and the willingness of government to use force to protect business interests. President Cleveland's decision to send federal troops to break the strike, justified as necessary to ensure mail delivery, establishes precedents for government intervention in labor disputes that consistently favor employers over workers. The political consequences of the Depression become apparent in the election of 1896, which frames many of the central issues of the Gilded Age in terms that force Americans to choose between competing visions of their nation's future. William Jennings Bryan's campaign for the presidency mobilizes farmers, workers, and small business owners who feel threatened by the concentration of economic power in the hands of large corporations and Eastern financiers. His famous declaration that mankind shall not be crucified upon a cross of gold articulates popular resentment against financial policies that seem designed primarily to benefit creditors and investors. The Republican response, orchestrated by industrialist Mark Hanna and delivered through William McKinley's carefully managed campaign, argues that prosperity depends on maintaining existing economic arrangements and resisting political interference with business operations. McKinley's victory demonstrates that despite widespread concerns about inequality and corporate power, most Americans remain convinced that their long-term interests lie with continued industrial development and economic growth, rather than with fundamental changes to the economic system. The election of 1896 thus represents both the climax and the resolution of many of the political tensions generated during the Gilded Age. Bryan's defeat shows that populist challenges to corporate capitalism lack sufficient support to achieve political success, while McKinley's victory provides reassurance to business leaders that their position remains secure. The subsequent return of prosperity during McKinley's presidency appears to vindicate the Republican argument that economic growth benefits all Americans, even if the benefits are not equally distributed. The prosperity that returns during the late 1890s reflects partly the natural recovery from depression, but also the continuing expansion of American industrial capacity and international markets. The Spanish-American War stimulates demand for manufactured goods while demonstrating American productive capabilities to international observers. The discovery of gold in Alaska and South Africa increases the money supply, easing the deflationary pressures that had contributed to agricultural distress during the early 1890s. The return of prosperity also coincides with technological and organizational innovations that further increase the efficiency and scale of American industry. The development of modern steel production techniques allows American companies to produce high-quality steel at costs that make American products competitive in international markets. The introduction of scientific management principles, pioneered by engineers like Frederick Winslow Taylor, systematizes production processes in ways that increase productivity while also intensifying the pace and control of industrial work. These developments in manufacturing efficiency interact with improvements in transportation and communication to create possibilities for business organization on unprecedented scales. The formation of United States Steel Corporation in 1901, capitalized at over $1 billion and controlling approximately 60% of American steel production, represents the logical culmination of trends toward corporate consolidation that have been building throughout the Gilded Age. Similar mergers create dominant corporations in industries ranging from oil and tobacco to sugar and agricultural machinery. The emergence of these giant corporations transforms the American economy while also creating new political and social challenges. The efficiency and productivity of large-scale enterprises contribute to American economic growth and international competitiveness, but the concentration of economic power in the hands of a few corporations raises serious questions about the compatibility of big business with democratic institutions. Critics argue that corporations have become so large and powerful that they constitute a threat to democratic government and individual liberty. The response to corporate consolidation reveals deep divisions within American society about the proper relationship between business and government. Business leaders argue that large corporations represent natural and beneficial evolution toward greater efficiency, while critics contend that monopolistic practices harm consumers and undermine competitive markets. Progressive reformers begin to advocate for antitrust legislation and government regulation as necessary measures to preserve democratic institutions and competitive capitalism. The assassination of President McKinley in 1901 brings to the presidency Theodore Roosevelt, whose energetic approach to executive leadership symbolizes America's emergence as a global power, while also representing new approaches to the problems created by industrial concentration. Roosevelt's background as a New York aristocrat who has embraced the strenuous life of Western ranching and military service embodies the combination of elite education and democratic values that characterizes progressive era reform movements. Roosevelt's presidency marks a turning point in American attitudes toward business regulation and government responsibility, but it also builds upon developments that began during the Gilded Age. His trust-busting campaigns target the most egregious examples of monopolistic behavior while accepting the basic legitimacy of large corporations. His conservation policies preserve natural resources for future development while serving the interests of efficient resource management. His foreign policy initiatives project American power globally while serving the interests of American business expansion. The emergence of America as a world power during the early 20th century represents the international projection of the industrial and organizational capabilities developed during the Gilded Age. The construction of the Panama Canal, begun under Roosevelt's presidency, demonstrates American engineering and organizational skills while also serving strategic and commercial interests. The Great White Fleet's circumnavigation of the globe announces American naval power to the world, while also demonstrating the industrial capacity that makes such displays possible. America's growing international influence also reflects the maturation of the financial system developed during the Gilded Age. By 1900, American capital markets have become sophisticated enough to compete with London as sources of international investment capital. American banks and investment houses begin to finance development projects throughout Latin America and Asia, extending American economic influence far beyond the nation's political boundaries. The dollar begins to challenge the British pound as an international reserve currency, reflecting America's emergence as a major economic power. The cultural implications of America's rise to world power status become apparent in the growing international interest in American ideas, institutions, and cultural productions. European observers study American industrial methods, educational systems, and democratic institutions as models that might be adapted to their own societies. American universities begin to attract international students, while American scholars gain recognition in international academic communities. The emergence of distinctly American forms of popular culture during this period also reflects the nation's growing confidence and cultural independence. Ragtime music, developed primarily by African American composers and performers, becomes internationally popular while demonstrating American innovation in musical forms. The early motion picture industry, centered increasingly in California, begins to develop narrative techniques and production methods that will eventually dominate global entertainment markets.